They say the dead keep their secrets better than the living. And if that is true, then beneath the stone floors of Westminster Abbey lies the greatest secret of all. The woman they called the Virgin Queen has slept there for more than 400 years, wrapped in lead and silence, untouched and unread. Her reign was glorious, her legend untouchable. Yet the body that built an empire may hold a truth so dark that even now England refuses to let the light in. The story of Elizabeth Tudor does not begin with her crown, but with her corpse, and what they found when they finally laid her down. It is a story of masks, of flesh and fire, of a queen who ruled for 45 years and died refusing to lie in her own bed because she believed that death was waiting beneath the sheets. In the late winter of 1603, the rooms of Richmond Palace smelled of lavender and rot. The scent was meant to hide something worse, something that crept from the Queen's own body, the smell of slow decay. For 17 days, she sat upright, surrounded by silk pillows. Too proud or too frightened to rest, her ladies begged her to lie down, to let them carry her to bed. But she shook her head with the stubbornness that had carried her through wars and betrayals. "The bed is a trap," she whispered, "and death waits there." Outside, the March wind rattled the windows. Inside, the candles burned low and flickered against her hollowed face. The woman who had once stood at Tilbury in armour, promising her soldiers she had the heart of a king, now trembled in a chamber lit only by the ghosts of her victories. When she finally died, just before dawn on the 24th of March, her ladies began to undress her, as was the ritual for queens. What they uncovered would haunt every woman in that room for the rest of her life. The corset that had held her upright for decades had carved grooves deep into her skin. The ribs beneath twisted inward from the pressure of whalebone and steel. Her face, stripped of its mask of white powder, was blackened with rot. Where the makeup had been scrubbed away, skin came with it, and lower still, between her legs, they found something none of them could name. The eldest lady fainted. Another screamed. A third whispered a prayer. Within hours, guards sealed the doors. Priests were called, and the coffin was brought forward, not wood, but solid lead, waiting to swallow the evidence. From that moment, the cover-up began. Orders came directly from her council. Speak nothing of what you saw. Not to your husbands. Not to your confessors. Not even to God. The women were sent away to distant estates. The physicians dismissed. And the chamber scoured clean. The air itself seemed to shiver with the weight of what had been hidden. By nightfall, the coffin was sealed with molten metal, its edges fused tight so that not even a whisper could escape. The next morning, the bells of London tolled for good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, the saviour of England. No one spoke of the horror behind those bells, of the truth embalmed with her body. To understand what they buried that day, you must go back to the beginning, to the child who learned before her 3rd birthday that being born a woman was a dangerous thing. On a cold morning in May of 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold inside the Tower of London, her dark hair unbound and her eyes lifted to the sky. The crowd was silent as the French sword flashed. And somewhere in the palace, a little girl in a red velvet gown waited for a mother who would never return. They told her Anne had been wicked, that she must never speak her mother's name. And in that silence a legend began. Elizabeth learned early that love could turn to execution, that a woman's body was never her own, and that survival depended on performance. She watched her father's wives die one by one, each teaching her a new rule for staying alive. Be quiet, be careful, be invisible. When Henry VIII died, his flesh already splitting from the poison in his leg, Elizabeth was 13 years old. alone in a court that devoured women like a feast. By the time she took the crown in 1558, she had built herself into a creature of masks and intellect, a woman of learning who could quote Latin scripture as easily as she could command armies. Yet beneath the gold and language, there was something else. A strangeness whispered about by her ladies. A secret carried in the silence of her chambers. Her voice was deeper than any woman's. Her height taller. Her body strong and angular. Her face ageless and unreadable. Ambassadors wrote home that the Queen of England was unlike other women. And her doctors, those few allowed near her, left her rooms pale and trembling. For nearly half a century she wore the mask of perfection. The white face that became her symbol was painted with poison lead and vinegar, mixed to form the substance called Venetian ceruse. Day after day she covered herself in it, sealing her skin beneath a layer of death so that she might appear untouched by time. The poison seeped into her flesh, into her bones, into her mind. Headaches, stomach pain, trembling hands, rages that frightened, even her closest advisors, all the slow signs of lead poisoning that no one dared name. And beneath her gowns, the corset crushed her lungs and liver until her organs reshaped themselves around the whalebone cage. To stand before her court, to project power, she sacrificed breath itself. Every bow, every smile, every graceful movement was an act of endurance. When Mary, Queen of Scots, came to England seeking refuge, Elizabeth saw in her the mirror of everything she could never be: young, fertile, adored, a mother. For 19 years she kept Mary imprisoned, both enemy and sister, until the day she signed the death warrant with a shaking hand. When the axe fell at Fotheringhay Castle, it was not only Mary's head that rolled, but Elizabeth's last chance at peace. From that moment her decline quickened. Her hair fell out. Her teeth decayed. The smell of infection followed her through the palace corridors like a shadow she could not escape. By the end, the myth had devoured the woman. The painters still showed her as a goddess, flawless and immortal, while the reality beneath the jewels was collapsing. When she refused her bed in those final weeks, she was not only defying death, she was defying truth. To lie down would have meant removing the mask, loosening the corset, revealing what time and secrecy had done to her. She had spent her life performing power. Now she performed survival. And even in death, she would not allow the world to see her undone. They buried her beside her half-sister Mary, the woman she had hated and feared, sealing two queens into the same stone tomb. But unlike Mary's, Elizabeth's coffin has never been opened. Not in 1810 when the chapel was repaired. Not in 1952 when historians begged for permission. Not even in 21st century laboratories when science could have solved the mystery without disturbing her rest. Every request has been denied. The answer? They say, lies in respect for the dead. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps the legend is too valuable to destroy. For more than 400 years, England has lived under the shadow of that sealed coffin. The Virgin Queen, pure and powerful, untouched by man or time. It is a story too perfect to question. Yet somewhere deep beneath the abbey, a body waits, carved by whalebone, burned by lead, hiding the evidence of a lifetime spent pretending to be divine. And maybe that is the final secret Elizabeth Tudor kept: that power, when worn too long, becomes its own kind of poison, and that perfection always demands a body to rot beneath it. The story of Elizabeth Tudor truly began on the morning her mother died, the morning when the sound of a falling sword divided her life in two falling sword. It was the 19th of May in the year 1536. Grey London day. Heavy with drizzle and the smell of wet stone. The Tower of London, That fortress of kings and graves stood surrounded by thousands of people who had come to watch the execution of Queen Anne Boleyn. Some were curious, some were hungry for blood, and some whispered prayers, afraid that God might strike them for watching a queen die. Inside the palace, a little girl, not yet 3 years old, stood near a window, her small hands pressed against the cold glass, listening to the faint roar of the crowd. She did not yet know what death meant, only that her mother's name had become a curse, and that the air in the corridors had changed. The servants spoke in whispers now, and no one looked her in the eye. Her mother's head fell cleanly beneath the blade of a French executioner brought across the channel, because he was said to be the swiftest and most merciful. The crowd gasped, then cheered, for the Tudor court had taught England that the end of a queen was nothing more than theatre. Somewhere not far away, Elizabeth was told that her mother had gone on a journey and would not be coming back. The words were gentle, but the truth settled in her bones like cold water. The laughter of courtiers turned sharp. Her rooms grew smaller, and her name was stripped away. Within days, she was no longer Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne, but merely Lady Elizabeth, the bastard daughter of a disgraced woman. Her household was dismissed, her tutors sent elsewhere, and the little girl who had once been the centre of a kingdom was moved to a distant manor with only a few frightened attendants. That was the first lesson she learned, that safety was an illusion. In her father's England, love could end on a scaffold, and a crown could become a weapon aimed at one's own family. The girl who watched her mother vanish grew up surrounded by ghosts, and each ghost had something to teach her. From Jane Seymour, she learned that obedience was rewarded with a shroud. For Jane died, birthing the son her father wanted more than any living woman. From Anne of Cleves, she learned the value of surrender. For the clever German queen survived by agreeing to annulment, calling herself the king's sister, and walking away, rich and alive. From Catherine Howard, young and foolish and beautiful, she learned that beauty was the sharpest blade of all. And from Catherine Parr, the last wife, she learned the only rule that mattered: keep your thoughts hidden, your words measured, and your face calm, even when your heart is burning. As a child, Elizabeth was quiet and watchful, the kind of child who noticed everything and spoke little. While other girls embroidered cushions, she memorized Latin declensions and studied the Bible in Greek. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, once wrote that her mind was sharper than any man's he had ever met. But what he did not understand was that for Elizabeth, knowledge was not a pleasure, it was armor. Words could not be taken away. Languages could not be executed. Each phrase she mastered was another shield against a world that had already shown her its cruelty. By the time she was 13, when her father's enormous body finally gave out to the poison of his own decay, she already knew how to wear silence like a crown. Henry VIII's death should have brought relief, but it only changed the shape of danger. His young son, Edward VI, became king at 9 years old, and the realm fell into the hands of ambitious men who ruled in his name. They burned Catholics 1 month and Protestants the next, and the air of England filled with the smell of smoke and fear. Elizabeth learned to pray, according to whoever held power that week. When the country demanded Protestantism, she read the English Bible aloud. When whispers said the old faith might return, she bowed her head to Latin prayers. It was not hypocrisy, it was survival. In those years, her body began to betray her. The signs of womanhood did not come as they did for other girls, and when they came, they were strange and painful. Her ladies spoke softly of it, their faces tight with worry, but she silenced them with a glance. If her father's kingdom had taught her anything, it was that difference was death. Then, in the year 1553, everything changed again. Edward died young, coughing blood until his skin turned grey, and the crown passed to her half-sister Mary, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who was devoutly Catholic, and filled with the memory of her mother's humiliation. To Mary, Elizabeth was not a sister, but a living reminder of sin, the child born of the woman who had stolen their father's love. Within months, the fires of Smithfield began to burn. Heretics, they were called, though many were only guilty of praying in English. The smell of charred flesh drifted through London's alleys. Elizabeth was 20 years old when Mary's guards came for her. Accusing her of treason and rebellion, they took her through the cold March rain to the Tower of London, through the same gates where her mother had entered and never left. The oars struck the river with dull rhythm as the barge moved under Traitor's Gate, that mouth of stone through which hope vanished. She sat in the boat, soaked to the skin, refusing to step out until she had spoken her defiance. "I am no traitor," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I am the king's true daughter." Yet her protest meant nothing. She was led through dripping corridors into a cell in the bell tower, where the walls wept with dampness, and every echo sounded like the steps of an executioner. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. She heard the footsteps of prisoners being taken to die, the creak of the gallows, the low murmur of priests granting last confessions. Each sound reminded her that she might be next. The fear did something to her body. It hollowed her from the inside. Her monthly bleeding, which had always been uncertain, stopped completely. Sometimes pain struck her so sharply she doubled over on the cold stone floor. The guards whispered that the princess was ill. Perhaps cursed. Perhaps mad. She told them nothing. She had learned to let silence speak for her. When she was finally released and sent to house arrest in the countryside, she was thinner, and harder, and colder than before. She had learned what it meant to be caged, and she had survived it. And as she watched the fires of her sister's persecution burn across England, she understood something else, that power was safer than innocence. A powerless woman could be destroyed in a day, but a queen could turn her pain into armor. The years that followed would test her more than she could imagine. She would inherit the throne of a divided nation and rule it with a mask that never slipped. She would become the Virgin Queen, the mother of none and the monarch of all. But in those early years, locked in the tower, the legend was already taking shape. The child who had listened to her mother's death, the girl who had learned to survive by silence, was becoming something new, a woman who would one day make the whole world kneel, even as her own body betrayed her. And if she sometimes heard the echo of a sword in her dreams, if she sometimes smelled the smoke of those who had burned, she said nothing. She had learned too well what silence could buy. Her power would come not from love or faith or even destiny, but from the one truth she had known since that grey morning in May, that in the House of Tudor, a woman who wished to live must learn to master death itself. When Elizabeth Tudor stepped out of the Tower of London in the spring of 1554, the rain still clung to her hair like chains. She was alive, and that was miracle enough. Behind her, the stone walls that had swallowed her mother and so many others faded into mist. But the fear they had planted inside her never left. She had entered the tower as her sister's prisoner and emerged as something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The months she spent waiting for death had carved away the last traces of the girl she once was. What remained was a woman who understood that in Tudor, England, survival was not a gift. It was a performance. Every smile, every silence, every tear had to serve a purpose. Every mistake could be fatal. Mary Tudor had spared her, though not out of love. England was uneasy. The fires at Smithfield burned day after day, and the city stank of charred flesh and fear. To kill her sister now? Mary's council warned, would risk rebellion. Elizabeth's name had become a banner whispered among Protestants, a symbol of hope in a land ruled by flame. So the Queen of England kept her younger sister under watch, instead locked away in old manors, surrounded by guards. Her letters opened. Her visitors questioned. Her every word recorded. Elizabeth smiled, curtsied, and said nothing of what she truly thought. She was learning the art that would define her reign, how to hide a dagger behind a velvet glove. While Mary burned heretics in God's name, Elizabeth played the dutiful subject. She attended Mass in Latin, bowed her head, and mouthed the prayers she did not believe. In secret, she read English psalms, whispering the forbidden words beneath her breath. She wrote letters filled with warmth and loyalty, calling her sister my most gracious and noble queen. Each sentence was a masterpiece of deceit, so gentle, so carefully phrased that no one could accuse her of treason. Her ladies learned to imitate her composure, to smile when the guards entered, to weep only in silence. When the men of the household grew restless, dreaming of rebellion, she silenced them with a single look. "We live by patience," she said once, and the words were truer than any prayer. 2 years passed. Mary married Philip of Spain, and the country grew restless again. The people hated the idea of a foreign king. They feared their land would become a Spanish province, their gold sent across the sea, their daughters forced into convents. Mary's phantom pregnancies, 2 of them, only made things worse. Each time she swore, she felt the child move, her belly swelling with hope. But no baby came. Elizabeth, hidden away at Hatfield, watched the news with cold understanding. Her sister's body had betrayed her, just as her own body had always betrayed her. Power built on the promise of children was the most fragile power of all. When Mary died in November of 1558, the air over England changed. Bells tolled in every village, and people crossed themselves in the streets. But beneath their mourning there was relief. The reign of fire was over. At Hatfield House, Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree when the messengers arrived. She had been reading in Greek, the words of the Psalms flowing from her lips when the riders dismounted and knelt in the mud. "Your Majesty," they said, "Mary is dead. You are Queen of England." For a long time, she said nothing. The book fell from her hands. Then, quietly, she whispered a line from Scripture. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." She was 25 years old, and her kingdom was broken. The treasury was nearly empty. The countryside, divided by faith, and the great powers of Europe waited like wolves at the border. Spain still dreamed of conquest. France still plotted for revenge. At home, her councillors argued that a woman could not rule without a husband. Parliament begged her to marry and secure the line. Elizabeth listened to them all, her face serene, her eyes unreadable, and gave the answer that would define the rest of her life. "I have already bound myself to a husband, the Kingdom of England." Yet even as she said it, she knew what it cost. To rule alone was to walk a knife's edge. Marriage might bring protection, but it would also bring chains. Any husband would expect obedience. Any pregnancy would threaten her life. And worst of all, intimacy would mean exposure. Her body, the one secret she had guarded since childhood, would no longer be her own. She could not risk that, not after what she had seen, not after what she knew about how easily a woman's body could destroy her. So she smiled and said she would think about it. And for the next 45 years, she thought about it and never decided. The first years of her reign were a balancing act between faith and fear, She restored the Protestant Church, but carefully, so as not to provoke civil war. She let the old Catholic lords keep their lands, demanded only that they attend her services and swear loyalty. The people called her cautious. Her enemies called her deceitful. Both were right. Elizabeth knew that power was not in the sword, but in patience. She had learned that lesson in the Tower, where silence had kept her alive. Now she ruled with that same silence, using charm and calculation where her father had used blood. She surrounded herself with clever men. William Cecil, her steadfast counsellor, Francis Walsingham, the cold-eyed spy master who built a network that stretched across Europe, and Robert Dudley, the childhood friend who became the centre of her heart. With them she played her greatest game, keeping England safe by keeping everyone guessing. She flirted with kings and princes, as if diplomacy were a courtship, promising alliances she never intended to seal. Spain offered Philip once more. Even though he had been her sister's husband, she smiled and thanked him for his devotion, then delayed until he gave up in frustration. France sent its young princes, one after another, each hopeful, each turned away with compliments and gifts. While Europe wondered who would win her hand, Elizabeth built her legend. She was the Virgin Queen, pure and untouchable, married only to her country. It was a perfect disguise, a wall of virtue so radiant that no one could see the truth behind it. The people adored her. Poets compared her to Diana, the goddess of chastity. Her courtiers worshipped her like a saint. But in the quiet hours, behind the locked doors of her chambers, she was only a woman tired, lonely, and scarred by what she had endured. The mirror on her wall reflected both the monarch and the prisoner she had once been, and some nights she would touch the reflection as if to remind herself that they were the same. She had survived the Tower, survived her sister, survived the kingdom's hatred and her own body's betrayals. But the past never truly dies. It only changes shape. Sometimes, when she heard the rain against the palace windows, she would remember the sound of the river beneath Traitor's Gate. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she would see her mother kneeling in the drizzle, the sword flashing silver before the world went still. In those moments, the queen would vanish, and the child would return. The child who had learned that love was a blade, and that to live, one must never let anyone hold it close. In the years to come, Elizabeth's reign would be tested by war, betrayal, and the slow corrosion of time. But in the spring of 1559, as she stood beneath the coronation canopy in Westminster Abbey, she smiled with the calm of someone who had already faced death and won. The golden crown rested on her red gold hair. The church bells roared, and for the first time in England's long, violent century, the people cheered, not out of fear but out of love. They could not know what it had cost her to stand there, what she had endured to earn that sound, or how much she would still have to lose to keep it. Elizabeth Tudor was no longer a prisoner, but she would never be free again. In the first years of her reign, Elizabeth Tudor seemed almost supernatural, as if the blood-soaked past of her family had ended with her, and she alone had been chosen to redeem it. The people adored her, calling her Gloriana, their radiant sovereign who ruled with both a man's courage and a woman's grace. But the truth beneath that halo was far darker. Every day of her reign demanded a performance, and every performance demanded a price. In a world built for men, the only way for a woman to rule was to become a symbol, and symbols are not allowed to bleed, age, or fail. So Elizabeth began to build the image that would define her for centuries, the face of perfection. White as marble, ageless and untouched by time. What no one knew was that this perfection was eating her alive. The transformation began slowly, almost innocently, as fashions of the court demanded paler skin, a mark of purity and wealth. The mixture used to achieve that ghostly whiteness was called Venetian ceruse, a combination of white lead and vinegar. It was expensive, admired, and deadly. Each morning, her ladies would grind the paste until it gleamed like pearl, and Elizabeth would sit before her mirror while they smoothed it over her face and neck in layers so thick that her skin disappeared beneath it. At first it felt cool and harmless, the way a mask might comfort an actor before the play begins. But the poison did its work quietly, slipping into her bloodstream through the small cracks of her skin, creeping into her bones. The headaches came first, then the tremors in her hands, then the sudden bursts of fury that frightened even her most loyal servants. Yet she could not stop. The court expected the Virgin Queen to look divine, unchanging, immortal. To remove the mask would have been to reveal weakness, and weakness was the one sin she could never afford. The years rolled on, and the lead mask grew thicker. The skin beneath it began to die. By her 40th year, she was already covering the damage with still more ceruse, layering poison upon poison. Her ladies tried to hide their horror as the sores spread across her cheeks and jaw. Tiny at first, then larger, weeping fluid that smelled faintly of metal, perfume and incense filled the royal apartments. But the stench of corruption lingered, no matter how many candles were burned. To the court, she remained untouchable, a creature of light. But those who dressed her saw the truth. At night, when they washed the makeup away with vinegar and rosewater, strips of skin came off with it. They would whisper prayers as they worked, terrified that their queen might notice the tears in their eyes. The corset was her second mask, one made not of poison, but of pain. To achieve the upright, rigid posture of a monarch, Elizabeth bound herself into whalebone, stays so tight she could scarcely breathe. Day after day, year after year, she endured the slow reshaping of her ribs and spine until her body itself became a cage. It gave her the bearing of authority she desired, tall, unyielding, magnificent, but it also made every movement an act of endurance. Her ribs pressed against her lungs, her stomach twisted, and sometimes the pain was so sharp she would excuse herself from council meetings to retch in private. Her doctors urged her to loosen the laces, but she refused. A queen must never appear small. She told them, even when she is dying. Robert Dudley was the only one who saw beyond the mask. Or perhaps he saw only the parts of it that reflected his own ambition. He had known her since childhood, and now, as Earl of Leicester, he stood closer to her than any man alive. They rode together, hunted together, laughed together, and their closeness sparked endless rumors. In the eyes of the court, he was her secret husband, her forbidden law. But the truth, like everything about Elizabeth, was complicated. She trusted him because he reminded her of youth, of the brief moment when love had seemed safe. Yet even with him, she could not afford to be only a woman. When his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the foot of a staircase in the year 1560, the whispers grew into open scandal. Some said she fell. Some said she was pushed. Some said the Queen herself had arranged it. Whatever the truth, it ended any hope Elizabeth might have had for peace. She could never marry him now. To do so would be to confess guilt, to brand herself as the murderous daughter of a murderous king. So she chose again the only safety she knew: distance. Denial. And the mask served her well. Under its gaze, England prospered. The country's treasury filled. Its enemies hesitated, and its poets sang her praises. The Virgin Queen, They called her chaste and eternal. Pain became her crown, and she wore it with pride. Yet the price of that legend was solitude. She watched the years steal away everyone she loved, her friends, her counselors, even Dudley himself, who died of illness in the autumn of 1588, leaving her a letter she kept locked away for the rest of her life. After his death, those who saw her said she aged overnight. The white mask grew thicker still, the rouge redder, the jewels heavier. The Queen of England became a ghost, haunting her own throne. The poison changed not only her body, but her mind. There were nights when she could not sleep, when the headaches made her scream until the maids fled the room. There were mornings when her temper burned through the palace like wildfire, leaving fear in its wake. But each time she appeared before her people, she smiled, radiant and flawless. The courtiers bowed, the crowds cheered, and no one saw the trembling in her hands or the dark circles beneath her eyes. She had learned the secret her father never mastered, that fear is most powerful when it is disguised as love. By the time the Spanish Armada sailed against her in 1588, Elizabeth's body was already failing. Yet her spirit blazed brighter than ever. She dressed in armour and rode before her troops at Tilbury, declaring that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. The soldiers roared with devotion, their cheers rising into the grey English sky. But when she returned to her tent, the strength drained from her, and she collapsed. Her ladies found her trembling, her skin burning with fever, the poison of her own beauty eating her alive. She recovered, as she always did, through sheer will. But something in her broke that day. She had played her part to perfection, and it had almost killed her. In the quiet years that followed, Elizabeth became less human and more myth. Pain was her constant companion, yet she spoke of it to no one. To admit suffering was to undo decades of legend. So she endured. Each morning the paint went on, the corset tightened, the jewels fastened. Each night the mask was peeled away, leaving behind the raw ruin of her real face. Her ladies worked in silence, their hands shaking as they cleaned the wounds that never healed. The Queen said nothing, staring at her reflection as if daring it to break. It was then that the portraits began to change. No longer the young warrior Queen of Tilbury. She was now painted as a goddess surrounded by suns, moons, and rainbows. Her face smooth as porcelain, her eyes ageless. The artist flattered her not out of loyalty but out of fear. They knew what she demanded to be remembered, not as a woman who bled and aged, but as a symbol that never died. The painters obeyed, and the legend grew. Behind that legend, the truth festered. The lead had seeped so deep into her flesh that even her bones must have glowed with it. Her teeth fell out, her hair thinned. Her skin, once pale by choice, turned grey by sickness. Yet she continued the ritual every day until the end. A mask of poison to hide the corruption beneath, to a corset of iron to hold together what time was tearing apart, and a smile that could still command a kingdom. That was Elizabeth, a woman who learned that to be immortal, she first had to die slowly, one layer at a time. By the time the year 1560 arrived, Elizabeth Tudor had been queen for barely 2 years, and already her council was restless, with the same demand whispered behind closed doors and shouted in Parliament halls. She must marry. She must give England an heir. Without one, the realm would fall into chaos the moment she died. To her councillors, marriage was not romance, it was insurance, a safeguard for power, a promise to keep the throne steady. But to Elizabeth, the word marriage carried the sound of a sword slicing through her mother's neck. She had watched love destroy every woman who came before her. Love was not a refuge. It was a trap, and she had sworn that no man, no matter how gentle, would ever hold the rope around her throat. Yet the world was relentless, and among all the suitors who came bearing crowns and promises, one stood closer than any Robert Dudley, the man who would become both her comfort and her curse. They had known each other since childhood. Both prisoners, once in the labyrinth of Henry VIII's court, both shaped by the same lessons of danger and survival. When Elizabeth became queen, Dudley was made master of the horse, a position that placed him by her side every morning, every ride, every hunt. He was tall and handsome, dark-haired, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and when he entered a room, the Queen's eyes always found him first. They laughed together, with a freedom she shared with no one else. And soon their closeness became the heartbeat of the court's gossip. Courtiers began to bow more deeply to Dudley. Ambassadors wrote to their kings that England's queen was already lost to love. And Elizabeth, who could command armies and silence parliaments, could not bring herself to silence her heart. But there was one obstacle that could never be moved. Robert Dudley had a wife, Amy Robsart, a gentlewoman of noble birth, lived quietly in the countryside, far from the glitter of court. She was sickly, lonely, and ignored. Elizabeth's affection for Dudley might have been tolerable had Amy lived out her days quietly. But fate chose a crueler path. On a September morning in the year 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, her neck broken. The servants who found her swore it was an accident. Others whispered that it was murder. Within hours, London buzzed with scandal. The Queen's lover's wife was dead, and the world demanded to know if the Virgin Queen had blood on her hands. Elizabeth's grief was complicated horror, sorrow, fear, and perhaps a guilty kind of relief. If Amy's death was a coincidence, it was the most disastrous one in history. If it was not, then the stain on Elizabeth's soul would never wash clean. Her council begged her to dismiss Dudley, to send him away until the gossip faded. But she could not. He was her only friend, her mirror, the one person who spoke to her not as a monarch but as a woman. Still, she knew marriage to him was impossible now. The scandal had poisoned their names together. To wed the man whose wife had just died would make her look complicit, guilty, damned, and so she did what she had done all her life. She hid behind control. She declared herself married to her kingdom, to God, to duty. I will have but one mistress here, she told her court, and no master. In that moment, the Virgin Queen was born, not from holiness, but from necessity. Her purity became her shield, her solitude, her weapon. The world would learn to revere the idea of Elizabeth, the eternal maiden who needed no man. But in the private hours of her chambers, she still read the letters Robert Dudley sent her, words filled with longing and loyalty, and she kept them locked in a box beside her bed. When he was near, she glowed with a warmth that defied the ice of her reputation. When he was away, she fell into silence so deep that even her ladies feared to speak. It was a love that had no body, no future, no peace. In the years that followed, Elizabeth turned love itself into statecraft. Every proposal became a negotiation. Every flirtation, a political weapon. Philip of Spain, her sister's widower, sent envoys offering alliance through marriage, but Elizabeth smiled and thanked him for his devotion. All while strengthening England's independence from his empire, the Archduke Charles of Austria courted her with portraits and promises, yet she stalled, demanded new conditions, and never answered. Eric of Sweden wrote her passionate letters that she returned unread. Her favourite game, though, was with France, the Duke of Anjou. Young, charming, and ambitious, she called him her little frog, and for years she let him believe she might accept him. The French rejoiced, the English protested, and through it all, Elizabeth held the balance of power in her hands. To the world, she was the coy maiden queen, fluttering between suitors. To those who truly understood, she was a strategist of terrifying brilliance, turning desire into diplomacy. But behind the laughter of her court, the pageantry, and the performances, Elizabeth's body continued to betray her. The same strange irregularities that had plagued her youth returned with more cruelty. Sometimes she would vanish from court for weeks, claiming illness. When she reappeared, she was paler, thinner, and more irritable. The headaches grew unbearable. Her hands shook as she signed decrees. Her doctors could offer no cure. They could only whisper among themselves that the Queen's constitution was peculiar, her humours unbalanced, her nature unlike that of other women. One physician dared to suggest that she take a husband for her health, and she dismissed him with a look that froze him where he stood. Her power grew as her flesh failed. The contradiction was almost divine. The weaker her body became, the stronger her legend rose. Pain became her ritual, control her prayer. When Dudley returned from military campaigns, grey-haired and weary, she greeted him with the same brightness as in their youth. But there was a distance now, a shadow between them that time could not erase. They had lost what they might have been, and both knew it. Still, when he fell ill in the late summer of 1588, she sent for him, wrote to him, waited for his recovery. Instead, a letter arrived sealed in black wax. Robert Dudley was dead. They said she locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing food, refusing light, refusing comfort. When her ladies at last entered the room, they found her sitting on the floor beside his unopened letter, the wax broken, but the paper untouched, as if she could not bear to read his final words. When she did, at last, her hands trembled as she folded it carefully and tied it with a ribbon marked in her own handwriting. His last letter, she kept it for the rest of her life. It was found years later among her private papers, yellowed and fragile from being held too often. After Dudley's death, Elizabeth withdrew deeper into solitude. The mask grew heavier, the poison thicker, the court keter. The poets called her divine, the Mother of England, the embodiment of purity. Yet the woman beneath the crown was fading, retreating into the only identity that had never betrayed her, that of the untouchable queen. In the painted halls of her palaces, portraits began to show her, not as she was, but as she wished to be remembered. Skin smooth as porcelain, eyes bright as stars, surrounded by symbols of eternity, the moon, the sun, the phoenix rising from its own ashes. These were not portraits of a person but of an idea, an immortal dream in human form. When she stood before her people, she appeared serene, but inside her was the slow, quiet collapse of a woman who had given everything to keep a crown. Love had become a ghost she could no longer speak to. Dudley's death marked the end of warmth in her heart, and she replaced it with iron. From that moment on, she ruled as though affection itself were a weakness, punishing her courtiers for their romances, mocking the marriages of others, declaring herself both man and woman, both sovereign and servant of none. The courtiers whispered that she was heartless. The ambassadors reported that she was incapable of tenderness. They were wrong. She had loved once, and the memory of that love was a wound that never healed. To be Elizabeth Tudor was to be both woman and monument, flesh and legend, alive and embalmed in lead while still breathing. Her loneliness became part of her crown, her suffering a kind of sanctity. As the century neared its end, the mask she had built began to crack. The beauty that had once been armor now revealed decay beneath. Yet even as her body failed, her voice remained steady, her will unbroken. In her counsels she was sharp as ever, her mind a blade honed by pain. When foreign kings spoke of alliances, she smiled and reminded them that England's heart was already taken by her, and her alone. And so the Virgin Queen continued her performance, the most magnificent act of endurance ever staged upon a throne. Beneath the layers of white lead, beneath the corset that crushed her ribs, beneath the jewels that glittered like frozen tears, she was still the girl who had watched her mother die and learned that love was the most dangerous thing in the world. Robert Dudley had been the only man who might have changed that truth, and even he had become part of her legend, a love story buried in silence, a ghost she could never touch, and a secret she would never share. When the bells of Westminster rang on cold winter nights, echoing through the dark corridors of her palace, the courtiers swore they sometimes heard the sound of footsteps, a man's boots on marble, a whisper of laughter carried by the wind, and in the Queen's chamber, Elizabeth would close her eyes, lift her head, and almost smile. For in that moment, behind the mask, behind the crown, behind 4 decades of lies and duty, she was simply a woman again, reaching out in memory toward the only love she had ever allowed herself to feel. A love that, like her kingdom, she ruled but could never hold. By the time the sun rose over England in the year 1578, Elizabeth Tudor had ruled for 20 years, and though her court glimmered with gold and poetry, she herself had become a fortress of habit. A woman half in armor, half in shadow, the Virgin Queen's image was everywhere on coins, in portrait, in poems that compared her to goddesses and saints. Yet the real Elizabeth, the flesh and blood beneath the white paint, was beginning to crumble. The years had pressed upon her like an invisible crown made of lead. She could no longer separate the woman she truly was from the monument the world demanded her to be. Every dawn began the same way: the ritual of transformation. The slow, painful construction of perfection. Her ladies entered her chamber with bowls of cold water and perfumes to mask the air, and she would sit before the mirror, pale as ash, allowing them to layer the poison on her face. The mirror itself was tilted away slightly, for she could no longer bear to see her reflection under full morning light. The mask, once a symbol of power, had become a prison. Her skin beneath was thin and blistered, her hair brittle as straw, her teeth loosened by decay. She could not smile without pain. When she spoke, her voice was still strong but rasped with effort, and her words were chosen with the precision of someone who knew that language was the last weapon left. Courtiers who had once flirted with her now bowed in awe, afraid to meet her eyes. The Queen, who had once danced until dawn, now avoided the great feasts, claiming illness. But everyone knew the truth. The beauty that had mesmerized England had become a phantom. Still, she refused to stop. The ceremony of her mask was the ceremony of her reign. To remove one was to surrender the other. In those years, the world beyond her court was trembling. The religious wars that had begun in her father's time continued to rage across Europe. Spain ruled the seas, and France watched England with suspicion. Every ambassador who came before her saw only the white, calm face, never the woman fighting nausea beneath the jewels. Elizabeth had learned that weakness, even the smallest tremor, could topple empires. So she smiled, she laughed, she made jokes sharp enough to draw blood. But when night came and her chambers emptied, She would press her hands against her temples to still the pounding in her skull, feeling the veins pulse beneath her skin as if the poison itself were knocking from within. In those sleepless nights, she began to see her reflection differently. The mirror no longer showed her as a queen or a woman, but as a ghost already fading. She would sometimes rise from her chair, cross the cold floor barefoot, and stand before it in the candlelight, staring at the cracks in her own disguise. The waxed white of the ceruse made her look almost inhuman, and behind it, she could imagine the corpse she would one day become still and silent, locked away in the abbey's dark. Perhaps it was then that she began to understand that the mask was not only her protection but her prophecy. She would die as she had lived, sealed in beauty that hid the ruin beneath. The courtiers called her radiant, but they also called her unpredictable. There were moments of warmth when she would speak gently to her musicians, requesting old songs from her youth, and moments of sudden fury when she would strike a servant for some small mistake. Her moods shifted like the tide, and no one could guess which sea they would face each day. The foreign ambassadors described her as both brilliant and terrifying. One wrote to his king that she possessed a man's heart in a woman's frame, and perhaps that frame cannot contain it without pain. He was right. The strain of being everything to everyone, the mother of her people, the virgin of virtue, the iron ruler of men was eroding her from within. It was in this fragile state that Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, returned to the stage of her life. In the summer of 1568, Mary had fled across the border into England, seeking her cousin's protection after a rebellion in Scotland. But Elizabeth, who trusted no woman and no fate, saw in her cousin not a refugee but a threat. Mary was everything. Elizabeth could never be beautiful, beloved, a mother. Her son, James, was already a living symbol of continuity, while Elizabeth's womb had long been the subject of rumours whispered in corridors and taverns. To Catholics, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, the child of an unbroken marriage, the heir of God's true faith. To Elizabeth, she was the embodiment of danger, a shadow that mirrored her own, but carried fertility instead of solitude. At first, Elizabeth tried to keep Mary safe but distant, lodging her in comfortable captivity, moving her from castle to castle. Yet as the years passed and rebellions broke out across the realm, Elizabeth's patience with her cousin hardened into cold hatred. Letters intercepted by Walsingham's spies revealed conspiracies that circled around Mary like vultures' plots to assassinate Elizabeth. To put the Catholic Queen on England's throne, the names changed, but the pattern never did. Each plot began with whispers, moved through coded letters, and ended with executions. Elizabeth's hands never held the rope or the blade, but every death bore her invisible signature. Each time, she told herself it was for the safety of her country. Each time, something inside her grew colder. 19 years passed with Mary as her prisoner. 19 years of silence and suspicion. The younger queen aged behind her prison walls while Elizabeth aged behind her mask. Both were trapped, both haunted by the same crown. Then came the Babington plot in the year 1586. The final test of Elizabeth's heart, when the intercepted letters proved that Mary had consented to the plan to kill her. Elizabeth could no longer deny the truth. Her cousin was her enemy. Still, the decision broke something in her. She signed the death warrant with a trembling hand, then tried to take it back, claiming later that her secretary had acted without permission. But the order had already been carried out. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary Stuart was beheaded in a cold grey hall at Fotheringhay Castle, dressed in crimson, the colour of martyrdom. When they told Elizabeth that the execution was done, she locked herself away for days. The court whispered that she had gone mad. She tore her clothes, refused food, and cursed those who had sent the warrant. Yet in truth, the fury was not at them, but at herself. Mary had been her mirror, her rival, her reflection. By killing her, Elizabeth had killed the last person who understood her loneliness. She had killed the only woman who shared her burden of queenship in a man's world. After that, her nights grew darker. She began to see faces in the corners of her room, to hear voices when none were there. Sometimes, her ladies found her whispering to the air, calling out names long dead. Her mother, her father, Dudley, and now Mary. The ghosts of her own making were gathering around her throne. But while the Queen of England battled her demons, her enemies across the sea prepared for war. Philip of Spain, enraged by Mary's death and Elizabeth's heresy, built the greatest fleet Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. The year was 1588. And Elizabeth, now 54, faced the storm that would define her forever. England was outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared. But Elizabeth had one weapon that no army could match: her will. She rode to Tilbury to address her soldiers, her body fragile, her armor gleaming. When she spoke, her voice rang across the field, trembling with exhaustion yet burning with conviction. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." The words were immortal, but the cost was human. That night, after the cheers faded and the soldiers returned to their posts, Elizabeth collapsed in her tent. Her face beneath the armor was pale as wax. Her lips cracked, her body racked with pain. She was carried back to her chambers, shaking, whispering prayers she had long forgotten. For weeks afterward, she lay in agony. Her Abdomen, her skin cold. Her physicians bled her, purged her, and prayed for her. But she survived, as she always did, by refusing to surrender. And when the Armada was scattered by storms, when the news reached her that England had been spared, she rose from her bed, dressed herself in white, and addressed her court as if nothing had happened. The legend grew even greater, while the woman beneath it diminished. After the victory, the mask became eternal. The portraits of the later years show her not as a queen of flesh and blood, but as an idle, ageless Serene, surrounded by symbols of power. Yet the reality was unbearable. The sores on her skin refused to heal. Her teeth loosened. Here, gumspleed, and her bones ached from the weight of the corset that never left her body. She drank wine to dull the pain, ate a little, and slept even less. Each morning, she ordered her ladies to paint her anew, the thick paste of lead sealing her wounds beneath a smooth illusion. The younger courtiers whispered that she was immortal, but those who dressed her knew the truth, that immortality was simply another word for endurance. Elizabeth had outlived her enemies, her lovers, her rivals, and perhaps even her own humanity. In the stillness of her chamber, she sometimes touched her reflection, tracing the cracks beneath the paint. The Virgin Queen had conquered time, but the woman had lost herself in the process. Every gesture, every breath, every word she spoke was rehearsed, as if even death would have to wait for her permission. She had once ruled by charm, by wit, by love. Now she ruled by fear, the same fear that once kept her alive. The courtiers trembled before her temper. The ambassadors praised her brilliance while recoiling from the coldness in her eyes. And England loyal, adoring England, worshipped her as a saint carved from marble, never realizing that beneath the marble there was only decay. In her final years, she no longer fought nations or armies. Her battle was with the reflection in the mirror, the one that dared to remind her that she was mortal. Each morning, when the ladies brought the paints and perfumes, she would look at herself and whisper something only she could hear, a phrase that sounded almost like prayer, almost like confession. No one ever knew the words. Some said it was Latin, others that it was her mother's name. Whatever it was, she would say it once, then raise her chin, ready to be transformed again into the queen the world demanded. Elizabeth Tudor had conquered every enemy but herself, and that was the cruelest victory of all. By the time Elizabeth Tudor entered the winter of her life, England had changed beyond recognition, yet she remained the one thing that refused to change. The century itself seemed to bend around her. Her hair had thinned to brittle threads the colour of dust. Her hands trembled like branches in wind, but her will was iron. She had ruled longer than any English monarch before her, and her name had become a spell, something whispered in fear, love, and exhaustion. The Queen, who had once been the symbol of renewal, now presided over decay, not only her own, but that of an age that no longer knew how to let her go. The courtiers still called her Gloriana, still bowed low before her jewelled gowns. But the jewels could not hide the truth. The Queen's body was collapsing beneath the weight of time and memory. The year was 1600. The air in the palace had grown colder. The tapestries faded. The candles burned lower. Elizabeth had begun to see death everywhere in the eyes of her servants, in the portraits of her youth that stared back from the walls, in the sound of her own footsteps echoing through corridors that once rang with laughter. The great men who had defined her reign were gone. William Cecil dead of old age, Francis Walsingham buried in silence, Robert Dudley dust for more than a decade. She kept his last letter close, tucked in a small box beside her bed. Sometimes she would take it out and touch the faded ribbon that bound it, her fingers tracing the loops of his handwriting. She no longer cried. Her body had long since forgotten how, but her silence held a grief deeper than tears. In those last years, Elizabeth's nights were filled with whispers. Servants spoke of footsteps in empty halls, of doors opening by themselves, of music that began without a musician. Some said the Queen's ghosts had returned Anne Boleyn with her head in her hands, Mary Stuart still draped in crimson, Robert Dudley waiting in shadow. Elizabeth, when told of these tales, only smiled faintly and said, "Then I am well attended." Yet when the candles were snuffed and the night settled heavy upon her, she would sit awake for hours, her eyes fixed on the flickering embers of the fire, as if searching their glow for the faces of those she had lost. Her court had grown wary of her temper. The slightest mistake could summon her fury. The smallest kindness could draw unexpected tenderness. Some days she would speak for hours, recalling her victories, her triumph at Tilbury, the ships of Spain scattered like broken wings. Other days she would fall into silence so deep that her ladies dared not breathe. The poets still compared her to the sun, but the truth was that her light now burned too brightly, consuming what was left of her. Her body was frail, her legs swollen, her teeth gone, her breath sour with sickness. Yet she refused to rest. She ruled even from her chair, issuing orders, signing decrees with hands that trembled so violently the ink often splattered across the page. "While I live," she said once to a courtier who begged her to sleep, "I will reign, and when I die, let the earth reign over me." There was a superstition at court that the Queen would not allow any mirror larger than a hand's breadth in her private chambers. The reason, whispered among the servants, was that she feared her own reflection. She had spent half a century being worshipped as beauty and power made flesh, and now that flesh betrayed her with every passing day. Her ladies painted her face still, though the paint cracked and flaked like plaster. The lead had eaten deep into her skin, leaving it grey beneath the powder, and the smell of sickness could not be hidden, no matter how much rose oil they used. Yet Elizabeth demanded the ritual continue. To her, the mask was no longer vanity, it was duty. England could not see her die. Not yet. The poets and courtiers tried to entertain her with plays and music. They brought her gifts, jewels, silks, poems written in trembling hands. But the queen, who once delighted in words and wit, no longer laughed. She watched the performances in silence, her eyes unfocused, as if she were listening to something distant. Once, during a court masque, the actors portrayed the triumph of the Virgin Queen over death. When the figure of death bowed before her and declared that even he was her servant, Elizabeth rose from her seat and whispered, "You are a poor liar," then turned away. The silence that followed was so deep that even the musicians stopped playing. Outside the palace, the world moved on. New faces rose in Parliament. New thinkers challenged the old faith. New lands across the sea carried England's name to places Elizabeth would never see. The age of discovery, born in her reign, had outgrown its mother, yet she clung to power with a fierceness that astonished even those who loved her most. Her councillors, desperate for stability, began to look toward the future. The question that haunted every corridor of Whitehall was one Elizabeth refused to answer who would succeed her. The Virgin Queen had no heir, nor child, nor husband. She had made herself eternal. But time would not wait. They urged her to name James of Scotland, the son of the woman she had executed, the boy she had orphaned. It was the logical choice, the only choice. But Elizabeth resisted. To give her crown to Mary's son was to admit that all her sacrifices, all her loneliness, had led back to the same bloodline she had tried to erase. Yet as the months dragged on and her strength waned, she began to soften. She spoke less of war and more of peace, less of herself and more of England's survival. When she finally allowed her councillors to meet James's envoys, she did not bless the arrangement, but neither did she forbid it. "When I am dust," she murmured, "let him have what I can no longer hold." It was not a choice. It was a surrender disguised as wisdom. By 1602, the Queen no longer rode or danced. She could barely climb the steps to her throne. Her appetite had vanished. Some days she ate nothing but sugared almonds and wine. Unable to stomach more, she grew thinner, her voice quieter, her patience shorter. Her ladies wrapped her in furs even in summer, for she shivered constantly. The doctors bled her, purged her, offered her tonics of gold, dust, and pearl. But nothing eased her pain. Still, she refused to admit illness. "My body may fail," she said, "but my spirit is England's, and it shall not fall." The people loved her for it. They did not see the nights when she clutched her chest in agony or the mornings when she could not rise without help. To them, she remained their Gloriana, immortal, unbroken, beyond mortal suffering. Then, in the early months of 1603, the silence deepened. The Queen began to withdraw from all company, refusing visitors, refusing to be touched, refusing even her bed. She spent her days sitting motionless on cushions in the middle of her chamber, her face turned toward the fire. Her ladies begged her to rest, but she shook her head. "If I lay down," she whispered, "I shall never rise again." For 17 days she sat like that, her body stiff, her mind wandering through the corridors of memory. Sometimes she muttered to herself, fragments of Latin prayers, verses of poetry, names long gone: Anne, Mary, Robert, The past had returned in full, and it surrounded her like a second court. Invisible, but unyielding. On the 23rd of March, she gestured for her counsellors to approach. The Archbishop of Canterbury knelt beside her and asked whom she would name as her successor. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her breath rattled in her throat. Then she raised her hand slowly and drew a faint circle in the air. The gesture was vague, but they understood. It meant the crown would pass to James, the son of Mary, the boy she had once feared. With that motion, the Tudor dynasty began to end. The great house her father had built through blood and desire would close with the woman who had spent her life trying to rise above both. That night, the Queen grew still, her eyes half open, her lips moving silently, as if in conversation with the shadows. The ladies who kept watch said that her face, without the mask, looked peaceful for the first time in decades. The lines of pain smoothed away, the weariness gone, but none could forget what came before the weeks of silence. The refusal to eat, the whispered fear that she had already begun to die while still awake. When her final breath came, just before dawn on the 24th of March, 1603, the candle beside her guttered out as if the flame itself had bowed in respect. The palace fell into mourning. The bells of London tolled across the grey morning, echoing along the river. In every church, candles burned for the woman who had ruled for 45 years. Her body was prepared in secrecy. The legend of her death would grow in time, that her skin was grey beneath the powder, that the corset had carved into her flesh, that what her ladies saw when they undressed her made them faint one by one. But in those hours, before rumour replaced reality, there was only stillness. The Queen who had commanded the world through the force of her will now lay motionless, her crown placed at her feet, her hands folded like a prayer. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, had finally surrendered. The Virgin Queen who once defied death now belonged to it. The mask had cracked, the silence had won, and the legend was complete. Yet even as her body cooled, there remained something in the air, a trace of her will, an echo of her defiance, as if she were not gone but merely waiting, just beyond the reach of the living, still listening, still watching, still refusing to lie down. The news of Elizabeth Tudor's death spread slowly at first, as though England itself refused to believe it. For nearly half a century she had been the heartbeat of the kingdom, the voice that spoke through wars, famine, and triumph. The people had grown so used to her presence that they could not imagine the world without it. On the morning of the 24th of March, 1603, London awoke to an eerie quiet, broken only by the tolling of church bells. From the Thames to the fields of Westminster, the sound rolled through the mist like the slow breathing of the dead. In every house, candles were lit, merchants closed their shops. The Queen, who had outlived everyone she loved, was gone, and yet no one could truly say they knew who she had been. Inside the royal apartments of Richmond Palace, the scene was a strange mixture of reverence and fear. Her ladies moved like shadows, wrapping her body in white linen, their faces pale as the walls around them. The smell of vinegar filled the room as the physicians worked in silence, dabbing her skin, sealing her eyes with wax, murmuring Latin prayers that none of them seemed to believe. They said her face, stripped of paint. I looked peaceful for the first time in decades, but what they saw beneath the mask made them tremble. Her skin was grey and thin as parchment, her teeth few and blackened, her hair almost gone, and yet even in death she seemed to command them. The body of a queen still demanded obedience. The first order from the council was absolute secrecy. The royal corpse was to be prepared and sealed immediately. No strangers permitted to look upon it. The reason was whispered, but never written. Something about the body was not meant to be seen. The rumors began before the coffin was even closed. Some said the lead paint had eaten through her flesh, turning it blue. Others swore her body was not entirely as it should have been, that there were marks, deformities, or signs of a truth England could not bear. The women who had undressed her fainted one after another, and the men who carried the coffin out of the chamber did so without speaking. Within hours, the room was emptied, scrubbed, and locked. The coffin itself was made of lead, thick and heavy, its seams soldered shut with molten metal so that no air, no prying eyes, could disturb what lay inside. The carpenters worked through the night by candlelight, their faces shining with sweat. And when they were done, the smell of scorched metal hung in the air like incense. No one was allowed to view the body again. Even the nobles who begged to pay their respects were turned away. The official reason was preservation. The real reason was fear. Outside the palace, England's transition was already underway. Messengers rode through the dawn to Scotland, carrying news to James VI that he was now James I of England. The Tudor line had ended. A new dynasty had begun. Yet before the living could celebrate their future, they had to bury their past. The council ordered that the Queen's remains be taken to Whitehall and then to Westminster for the state funeral. It would be the grandest ceremony the realm had ever seen, a spectacle designed to erase the shadows that clung to her final hours. For weeks, the preparations consumed the city. Seamstresses stitched banners embroidered with her emblems, the phoenix, the rose, the scepter, the crown. Black draperies were hung from windows. Mourners lined the streets, dressed in sable and grey. Every poet in London tried to find words worthy of her reign. Though none could capture the contradiction, she had been a woman who conquered the world, yet never conquered her own reflection. The people who had once feared her now wept openly, as if grief could absolve them of what they had whispered while she was alive. On the 28th of April, 1603, the funeral procession began. It stretched for miles, a river of black velvet and silver horses winding through London's narrow streets. The coffin, encased in wood and draped in her banners, was borne on a chariot pulled by 4 white horses covered in black cloth. Atop the coffin lay a wax effigy of the Queen, lifelike and serene, dressed in crimson and gold, her scepter in hand, her crown upon her head. To the crowds who watched, it was as if she was still alive, still ruling. They could not see the sealed lead coffin beneath, hidden from the world. The mourners followed in perfect order: bishops, nobles, courtiers, soldiers, all walking beneath banners marked with her devices. The bells of St. Paul's tolled in slow rhythm, and from the windows above, women threw flowers that fell like snow upon the procession. Some wept because they loved her, others because they feared what would come next. For 45 years, Elizabeth's will had held the realm together. Now that will was gone, and no one knew whether England would remain whole without it. At Westminster Abbey, the ceremony was long and magnificent. The choir sang her favourite psalms, their voices echoing up into the high vaults, like prayers climbing toward heaven. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke of her as our most glorious and virtuous sovereign, the saviour of England, the guardian of faith. Yet even as he spoke, those closest to the coffin exchanged uneasy glances. The air was heavy with something unspoken, as though the abbey itself resisted the lie of perfection. When the time came to lower the coffin into the vault, the priests hesitated, waiting for the council's signal. At last the order came: seal it. And so they did, lead upon lead, stone upon stone, until the Queen of England was buried, not only beneath the earth, but beneath layers of secrecy that would outlive her dynasty. After the ceremony, when the crowds had dispersed and the abbey returned to silence, the workmen continued their task below. The vault had been built deep, lined with thick slabs of stone to prevent decay from reaching the air. The coffin was placed beside that of her half-sister, Mary Tudor, two queens, who had once hated each other in life, now forced to rest side by side in death. Above them, the inscription reads simply, "Partners in throne and grave. Here, rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection." It was a beautiful lie, for neither sister had known peace in life, and neither would find it in death. Years passed, and the stories grew darker. Monks and scholars who visited Westminster claimed that strange sounds came from the Queen's vault at night, soft tapping, whispers, the faint hum of a woman's voice, singing. One record from the early 18th century spoke of a worker who swore he saw mist rising from the floor near her tomb, shaped like a woman with a crown of light. The abbey's clergy dismissed such tales as superstition, but the rumours persisted. Even the historians who sought to study her remains were denied permission. Her rest must not be disturbed, the Dean of Westminster said, though no one could explain why this rule applied only to her. Other monarchs had been exhumed, examined, even reburied. Only Elizabeth's coffin remained sealed, forbidden. In the centuries that followed, curiosity turned to legend. Some claimed that the lead had been fused, not merely to protect her body, but to hide it, that something about it could never be revealed. A few whispered that she had not been entirely woman, that the mystery of her body explained her refusal to marry, her obsession with control, her strange endurance. The stories multiplied until truth and myth became indistinguishable. Each generation added its own invention, that her physicians had been executed to silence them, that her ladies had taken vows of secrecy, that the effigy atop her coffin had been crafted not to honour her, but to distract from what lay beneath. And yet the legend served its purpose. The Virgin Queen remained untouchable. Her image, immortalised in paintings and coins, glowed brighter than ever. England, now under the Stuarts, looked back on her reign as a golden age, forgetting the sickness, the fear, the endless isolation that had consumed her. The mask had become her truth. The body beneath the abbey floor was irrelevant. The idea of Elizabeth was all that mattered. But deep in the stone vault, beneath centuries of dust and silence, her coffin endured, its lead shell corroding slowly with time. No historian, no priest, no monarch has ever dared to open it. Perhaps it is reverence, perhaps superstition, or perhaps fear that the secret within would change the story England has told itself for 400 years. In that darkness, sealed away from light, from air, from the living world, lies the final paradox of her reign. The woman who built her power on illusion now kept her greatest truth hidden forever. And maybe that is what she wanted all along. To be remembered not for what she was, but for what she seemed. To live on as the Virgin Queen. Unbroken, immortal, untouched. The coffin beneath Westminster Abbey is not merely her grave, it is her final act of mastery. The last performance of a life spent behind a mask. There, under the carved stone and the echoing chants of tourists and clergy, Elizabeth Tudor sleeps still, the woman who turned her own flesh into legend, who taught the world that power demands secrecy, and who even in death made England bow to her silence. Some say that when the abbey bells ring on cold March mornings, the air above her tomb grows heavier, as if something old and watchful stirs beneath. And perhaps it does, for the Queen who refused to lie down in life will not rise easily in death, not while her secret remains buried, not while the world still whispers her name. More than 4 centuries have passed since the bells of London tolled for Elizabeth Tudor, And still her story refuses to rest. The world has changed. Beyond recognition, kings have fallen, empires have risen, and yet her shadow remains. A pale figure glimmering through the corridors of English history. Every generation rediscovers her as though she was still alive. The Virgin Queen, the mother of a nation, the woman who chose power over love and mystery over truth. But the longer her legend endures, the more the silence beneath Westminster Abbey begins to feel like a question, one that hums beneath the stones and refuses to die. For what lies inside that sealed coffin may tell a story England was never meant to hear. When the 18th century dawned and the Enlightenment brought curiosity to every corner of the human mind, scholars and anatomists began opening the tombs of kings and saints in search of relics and remains. They studied bones, measured skulls, drew diagrams, and compared features to portraits long faded. The dead became their textbooks. Yet even in that age of reason, when science declared itself master of all mysteries, Elizabeth's grave remained untouched. When one clergyman dared to suggest an examination, his request was denied by royal command. No tool was ever allowed to strike the lead coffin. No scholar was permitted to look within. Officially, it was said that the Queen's rest should not be disturbed. Unofficially, those close to the Abbey whispered of another reason, a fear that her remains would not match the legend carved in marble above them. By the 19th century, as industrial smoke filled the skies and the Victorians made history into theatre, the fascination deepened. Writers spoke of Elizabeth as the first modern woman, the ruler who had defied her sex and shaped a man's world with a woman's mind. But behind the admiration lay unease. In private salons and academic societies, men debated her anatomy with the same fever that they once debated her politics. Some claimed she must have been disfigured by disease. Others hinted that she was born different altogether, that her refusal to marry had not been pride, but necessity. Physicians studied accounts of her illnesses and concluded that she may have suffered from a disorder of the body, something that blurred the boundaries of gender. The idea scandalized the public, yet it never entirely died. It lingered like a secret stain on the white fabric of her legend, the suspicion that her virginity had been less a virtue and more a veil. The first written record of what might have been discovered in her chamber at death appeared in a diary from the year 1604, penned by a minor court servant who claimed to have heard it from one of her ladies. The entry was brief but chilling. It spoke of a deformity never before seen in womanly body, and of a command that none should speak of what was viewed, lest the realm fall to shame. The diary was dismissed as rumour, but it resurfaced centuries later, in a private collection, and historians could not ignore it. Whether it was truth or invention, it fed the idea that something within Elizabeth's corpse had been too dangerous to reveal. Then came the year 1810, when Westminster Abbey underwent repairs to its royal vaults. Workers lifted the stones above several tombs, including those of Mary Tudor and James I. For inspection and reinforcement, Elizabeth's vault was listed among them. When they reached her section, the Dean of Westminster abruptly halted the work. No reason was recorded. The masons were paid extra to seal the floor again that very night. Later, one of them, an old man near death, told his grandson that the Dean had gone pale as he read the papers accompanying the coffin. He said the Queen is not to be opened. The mason recalled, "He said Her Majesty lies in perfection, and perfection must never be broken." The words were poetic, but the mason swore the Dean's hands shook as he spoke them. By the 20th century, Elizabeth's mystery had turned into obsession. Scientists proposed non-invasive examinations, X-rays, imaging, scans that could see through the lead without disturbing the coffin. Each time, the Church refused. Even in an age that no longer feared superstition, her tomb remained sacred. The British government, so eager to document every relic of its past, dared not touch this one. When pressed, officials replied with the same phrase repeated for centuries: Her Majesty must not be disturbed. Yet the tone of their refusal suggested not reverence, but fear, as if the ghost of the Queen herself still commanded them. For what if the truth, Oz revealed, undid everything England had built around her memory? What if the Virgin Queen was not the perfect woman of legend, but something more complex, perhaps not entirely woman at all? It is easy to worship the myth, harder to face the human beneath it. To uncover the truth of her body would mean tearing away the last veil she had woven around herself. And England has always loved its illusions more than its facts. So the coffin remains sealed. And the question lives on, but perhaps the truth is not in her body, but in the life she lived, in the choices she made to protect that secret. Every detail of her reign, when viewed through that lens, begins to make terrible sense. Her refusal to marry, her avoidance of childbirth, her distrust of doctors, her violent defense of her image. She was a woman who built an empire on control of her court, her body, her myth. If she was born different, then every decision she made was an act of survival, disguised as destiny. Her mask was not vanity but defense. Her solitude was not pride, but necessity. And her silence, that vast, unbroken silence that followed her into death, was her final triumph over the world that would have destroyed her if it had known. Even now, in the quiet of Westminster Abbey, that silence reigns. Tourists shuffle past her tomb, their footsteps echoing off the stone, unaware that beneath their feet lies a riddle that has haunted 400 years. The air around her vault is colder than the rest of the chapel, or so the guides say. The candles flicker strangely there, as if disturbed by a breath no living being can exhale. At night, when the abbey is empty and the lights are dim, the vergers who lock the gates sometimes hear a faint sound from below, not the creak of stone, not the shift of earth, but something softer, like fabric rustling or metal sighing. They do not speak of it, not out of belief, but out of respect. For to name it would be to break the spell. Every age has its ghosts, but Elizabeth's is unique. She is not the wandering spirit of guilt or vengeance, but the ghost of perfection itself. That impossible ideal, the living still chase, and the dead cannot escape. Her story endures because it touches the oldest hunger of humankind, the desire to be remembered, not as we are, but as we wish to be. In this, she succeeded more completely than any ruler before or since. Her power lives not in her bones, but in her legend, in the way her name still commands reverence, in the way her portrait still gazes down from museum walls with eyes that seem to see everything yet reveal nothing. And perhaps that is her final secret, that the truth, whatever it was, no longer matters. The mask has become the woman, and the woman has become the myth. The coffin beneath Westminster is not a prison, but a monument to transformation. Proof that even flesh can become idea, that even mortality can be rewritten by will. She once said that she knew she had the heart and stomach of a king. What she did not say, what she never had to say, was that she also had the soul of something far beyond a monarch, the soul of a survivor who turned her pain into a crown and her silence into immortality. If you stand in the abbey today, in that shadowed corner where her tomb rests beside her sisters, you might notice the faint carving on the stone above partners in throne and grave. It is a phrase meant to bind two queens together, but in truth it binds all of us to her, to the endless human desire to conceal our wounds beneath beauty, to build meaning from secrecy, to turn suffering into art. Elizabeth Tudor's secret, whatever it was, belongs not only to her, but to everyone who has ever chosen illusion over exposure, control over chaos, silence over shame. And so she sleeps. The queen who would not yield, the woman who became her own myth, the ruler who built an empire on the art of pretending. The lead that encases her is the same metal that once coated her skin heavy, toxic, radiant. It is both her poison and her protection. The centuries cannot touch her, the truth cannot harm her, even death cannot claim her fully. In the stillness of her vault, the legend breathes on. Perhaps one day someone will open the coffin, peel back the layers of time, and find what she left behind. Or perhaps the secret will remain buried forever, as she intended, so that she might rule eternity as she once ruled England, not through force or faith or love, but through the most enduring power of all, the power of mystery. For the Virgin Queen may have died, but Elizabeth Tudor never truly did. She lives in the silence she created, in the shadows that protect her, and in the unbroken question that still haunts the heart of every generation: who was she really? And what did she hide beneath the crown?